So now working our way into the spiral line, which as I alluded to is an absolute monster. There's a lot of anatomy points that are related to the spiral line. And I think to start very simple here, of all of the 4 primary myofascial lines, we can think of the spiral line as being our central engine. I can't really even think of any actions or movements that aren't going to incorporate the spiral line in some capacity. So essentially anything that we're doing is going to involve the spiral line, although we'll cover some ways that we can selectively bias this myofascial line. Taking it from that broad point of view, what we want to do here is start with taking it from that very broad and general view of the relevant anatomy. The building blocks for me for the spiral line are going to be formed really from locomotive and primitive patterns. So anything that is walking or sprinting oriented, anything that is crawling or reaching or rotating in nature, those are all going to incorporate or emphasize the spiral line. We also want to think about the sport-specific pattern, and it's not just for rotational athletes. I think that's one misconception with the spiral line, is that it invariably speaks to the rotational capacity of movement or athletics, and that's not necessarily the case. And that ties into kind of my third building block here, which is the spinal engine concept. Let's use a sprinter, for example, here, which is not typically defined as being a quote-unquote rotational sport, but when we think about the mechanics of sprinting, we think about that spinal engine pattern or the spiraling nature of the trunk relative to the pelvis as we go through those sprint patterns. And also not to mention the demands for head stabilization while we have trunk action or pelvic action. So for sprinting, it's a good representation of the right leg being in, or the right hip being in flexion, the left arm concurrently being in flexion, right arm being an extension, left hip being an extension. So we think about the compression of this portion of the spiral line in this case versus the tensioning or lengthening of this aspect of the spiral line, and what those trade-offs are. So again, when we have athletes that are high level, elite, developed, they've had several years of exposure or repetition, there's invariably going to be unilateral discrepancies between the right-left spiral line. And it's not our job to come in there and say, okay, now we need to rebalance and redistribute this out so that you're perfectly symmetrical from side to side. Again, we are thinking about this from a facilitation standpoint. So if there are detectable or observed differences unilaterally for the spiral line, that's great. The point that matters is, do we need to intervene on this? And then following that up with, how are we going to go about intervening on this? I skipped over it here, but let's go through the functional or the relative anatomy to the spiral line. And the spiral line is a really interesting anatomy path to follow. So we will start out here on the right side of the body, and the origin or the insertional point. So again, where the first 3 primary fascial lines all have insertional points on the humerus, the spiral line inserts at that occipital ridge on the back side of the skull. From here on the right side, we descend down through the neck extensors, through the traps and the rhomboids, coming around the medial border of the scapula here and wrapping under through that posterior inferior aspect of the scapula through the oblique and the serratus complex. So now we jump to the front side of the body, and we're still on the right side, coming around through the external oblique here and wrapping into some of the rectus abdominis. And then we have our transitional or our crossover point here through the interior oblique, and then coming down through the hip flexor into the TFL and into the IT band. So now we are tracking down the lateral aspect of the femur through the IT band, wrapping around the lateral condyle of the fibula, and then coming in through this tibialis anterior on the front side of the lower leg. The anterior tibialis is then going to cross the medial aspect of the medial malleolus and the medial aspect of the medial malleolus down through the midfoot, and then converge on the base plantar surface of the foot, and then ascend back up through the peroneal group, back through that kind of pocket on the posterior aspect of the knee. So again, now we are looking right at this region here, crossing through the biceps femoris into the sacrotuberous ligament, And then once we cross through the pelvis in that sacrolumbar fascial region, we'll see that tie-off point on the opposing side of where we started on the right side. So that would complete the anatomy for the spiral line. All mechanical actions that you can possibly conceive within reason are going to incorporate this spiral line, and you can hopefully now see as to why that is. But some of the key points for me are going to be the positioning of the head. Again, like I know forward head posture is something that's cited all the time. If we have true significant forward head posture, which was something with the Navy SEAL or the military group that was very prevalent, what does that do to the tensioning of the origin of the spiral line? So with all of the anatomy points that we just touched on, if we have disruption or aberrant movement or positioning in the cervical region, it's going to have some level of influence on the tensioning of the spiral line throughout. From there, rib cage and pelvis should speak for themselves here. Any kind of significant discrepancies with rib cage or pelvic positioning or movement capacity is going to influence the spiral line. But I want to come down to the foot here in this little interesting trade-off or intersection between the tendon of the anterior tibialis and the tendon of the peroneal muscle, and how that is influenced or disrupted by midfoot positioning and midfoot mechanical actions, where if we, again, just to take a common example, we see somebody who has a true midfoot collapse or a true medial arch drop, what does that do to this transitional point between the tendons of the anterior tibialis and the peroneal muscles? Does that create unnecessary slack? Does it create overt tension on, for instance, in this case, the peroneal muscle or the peroneal tendon based on that foot positioning? So then from there, how does that influence the biceps femoris or the upper leg or femur aspect of the spiral line? And then again, how does that feed into the pelvis? So it can become a very ambiguous and never-ending game that you can play with these mechanical relationships. But for the spiral line, I think those are a few that really are profound for me and are pronounced. With the training considerations or the mechanical considerations here, again, we can really pull on just about anything and say that we are emphasizing the spiral line. But for the sake of this portion, we're going to think about anything that requires thigh or arm switching. Obviously, sprinting and cutting are going to be predominant focal points here. I mentioned it, but that spiral engine concept, I think, ties in very nicely to the anatomy of the spiral line. Anything that is reciprocating in motion, and I'll actually say here, this is why I think that the rigidity of the contemporary strength and conditioning is something that we need to really pull away from, because our body it moves inherently and just naturally no matter what we are doing, there's going to be motion across these different segments. So if I'm doing something like a chop, I don't want them to be very robotic and a very static lower body and very stiff upper body and just moving the arms. I want everything to flow together, and I want to train that aspect of the motion rather than the isolated component in most cases. So again, to summarize here, it's a really big anatomy puzzle. We want to think about this from a very global sense and then zoom in on different aspects of the spiral line and think about maybe where we have some limitation or we have some restriction. How can we facilitate the entirety of the spiral line based on what we're seeing or what the athlete presents? Okay, so now if we just kind of take a look at a little bit of a movement compilation here to kind of show what exactly does this look like in training when we're trying to emphasize the spiral line, which, as we've covered, is a really dense and really all-encompassing anatomy. Like we covered on the slides, the broad points that we're thinking about here for the spiral line are rotation, reciprocation, and then I also kind of just throw transfer in there, and that'll be on display here in a second. But we're going to do almost everything from a split stance or a half kneeling position with the spiral line. I think about trying to, create the opposing hip action by having one inflection, one in extension to kind of get full tensioning of the spiral line. And so for this first one, we have Kai showing a great demonstration on just the conventional spiral line stretch. So for this, we have her rotating towards that front leg inflection, and as she rotates, she's going to press overhead and then breathe here at the end range. And for those of you who have tapped into the Fascia Line Stretch series, you'll recognize this clip. But then we see as she comes down, she's going to rebreathe, and then big inhale, exhale as she comes up. We want to make sure that we are actively cueing through the breath. On the anatomy for this, if I were going to flag her for anything here, we could probably have a little bit more of a closed grip here, but outside of that, everything looks fantastic. The reason for the medicine ball in the back here, honestly, we were kind of just playing around with some things and trying them some different ways, but just adding a little bit of extra tensioning through the quad, particularly the VL here, adding a little bit of flexion on the backside to the hamstring, so just kind of playing with the tensegrity of the pelvis. But it's pretty evident here to see where the spiral line anatomy is going to come into play. Moving on to the next one here. This is a crossover landmine transfer press, and you all already know how much I love my landmine variations, but this is a good one too. And again, despite the lack of attention on coaching here, this is a good one where we're really highlighting the spiral line. So in this starting position here, we see that left shoulder coiled into that right knee or that front leg, kind of closing down into hip flexion. And then as he goes through this action, we're going to initiate through the legs to drive the bar up and then hit our transfer point as the bar passes about the hip line. So this is an explosive dynamic action. We're getting obviously, some reciprocating patterns here, some reciprocating trunk actions, working from across the body and crossing the midline, which is another one that I really like for the purpose of the spiral line. Here, this is just some kind of a chop variation. It doesn't always necessarily need to be dressed up as much as this, but this is what we had in his programming for that day. So here we're just thinking about a violent punch, a violent rotation. This is an offensive lineman in off-season prep. So here we're just trying to kind of add a little bit of dynamic to it. But with the spiral line anatomy, we always want to think about the recoil and the reciprocation of the movement. And then here to finish, we have Kai just working a single leg drop landing here. Now, this is a good one to kind of point out that the anatomy and the terminologies with all of these fascial lines can get a little bit convoluted, to put it one way. So in other words, for this exercise here specifically, where the previous three are more purely the spiral line, here we can make an argument that this is anterior line. I usually classify single leg plyometrics or jumps as being more anterior focused because of the connection of the adductor longus to the contralateral shoulder. So, single legs just kind of biasing the front side. But we could easily make the argument that this is also a lateral line focus, being a unilateral drop landing where she's having to control medial lateral hip stability. And we could even take it as far as potentially even a posterior line because we're predominantly loading through the backside. So, again, some of this terminology is a little bit interpretive, but for the sake of this little clip here and for the sake of the spiral line, we're thinking about the closing off of the opposite shoulder to the foot that's landing. We're thinking about creating good continuity from the thoracic and even the cervical spine down through the pelvic cavity. And then on the bottom side, we want to remember too, with the spiral line, remember that we are going to essentially wrap beneath the foot and then come back up the leg. So really, if we wanted to be technical, anything that's dynamic in single leg is going to challenge that aspect of the spiral line.